The doors of St. Orison Chapel closed behind Gideon Price before the final prayer had ended. He stood on the stone steps in a dark caretaker's coat, holding a ring of iron keys that had belonged to his father and grandfather before him. Rain struck the chapel roof, running through the carved mouths of weathered angels and dripping onto the boots he had polished that morning. Inside, wealthy donors occupied every oak pew. Outside, Gideon heard the bolt slide into place. He had cared for the chapel for 28 years. That morning, the new owners treated him as though he had wandered in from the road. The chapel stood on a hill above the town of Bellwether, surrounded by ancient cedar trees and a cemetery older than most of the buildings nearby. Its narrow tower rose above the valley, holding a bronze bell so large that 12 men had once been required to raise it. For generations, people called it the Orison Bell. It rang for weddings, funerals, fires, floods, and the return of soldiers from war. During winter storms, its sound guided travelers toward shelter. When the river overflowed 50 years earlier, the bell warned the lower town before the water reached the first homes. Gideon knew every crack in its bronze surface. He knew which stair creaked in the tower, which window admitted rain, and how far to pull the rope so the bell produced a low warning rather than a full ceremonial ring. He also knew the bell had not been cast for the family whose name appeared above the chapel doors. That truth had remained hidden beneath a century of polished stone. The chapel's official history credited industrialist Horace Orison with building it in 1911 as a memorial to his wife. The bronze plaque inside the entrance read, St. Orison Chapel, a gift to the people of Bellwether from Horace and Eleonora Orison. Tour guides repeated the story. Newspapers repeated it. The Orison descendants repeated it whenever cameras appeared. Gideon's grandfather had told a different version. According to Samuel Price, the chapel had been designed, financed, and largely built by black quarry workers, carpenters, ironworkers, and stonecutters who lived in a settlement known as Lower Bellwether. Samuel's father, Ezekiel Price, supervised the construction. Horace Orison owned the quarry and provided the land. He also claimed the finished chapel as his family monument after the workers were never paid the final portion of their wages. Gideon had no contract proving it. Only family stories, old tools, and a faded photograph showing Ezekiel Price standing beside the unfinished bell tower. That was not enough to challenge a name carved in stone. So Gideon did what the Price family had done for generations. He maintained the chapel. His grandfather served as bellkeeper. His father repaired the roof, cared for the cemetery, and opened the doors every morning. Gideon inherited the work at 26. He remained when the congregation declined. He remained when the heating failed. He remained through snow, vandalism, leaking pipes, and 3 ownership disputes. Then the Orison family sold the property. The sale was announced 6 weeks earlier. Bramwell Heritage Group, a private development company controlled by the wealthy Valahurst family, purchased the chapel, cemetery, and surrounding hill. Its chairman, Preston Valhurst, promised to preserve the site. His son Conrad had different plans. Conrad Valhurst was 39, ambitious, and known for converting historic properties into luxury event venues. He intended to turn St. Orison Chapel into an exclusive wedding destination with a private restaurant in the old parish house. The cemetery would remain, but public access would be restricted during events. The lower field would become parking. The caretaker's cottage where Gideon lived would be demolished to create a scenic overlook. No one asked Gideon. He learned about the cottage from a surveyor's map left on the chapel table. When he questioned Conrad, the developer barely looked at him. You were informed that staffing would be reviewed after the sale. I was informed the chapel would be preserved. It will be. You marked the caretaker's cottage for demolition. It is not architecturally significant. My family has lived there for 90 years. That does not make it historically valuable. Gideon looked toward the chapel tower. My family kept this property standing before yours knew it existed. Conrad smiled faintly. I have heard many employees describe themselves as essential during transitions. I did not call myself essential. No? I said you do not know this place. Conrad's smile disappeared. I know its market value. The dedication ceremony for Bramwell's restoration plan took place on a Sunday afternoon. Donors, investors, local officials, and members of the Orison family arrived in black cars. White flowers decorated the altar. A string ensemble performed beneath the stained glass windows. Gideon prepared the chapel as he always did. He polished the brass, lit the wall lamps, checked the tower mechanism, placed umbrellas in the vestibule. Then Conrad stopped him near the front pew. "You will remain in the service area during the ceremony." Gideon thought he had misheard. "I always attend chapel events. This is a private presentation. I was invited by Reverend Clay. Reverend Clay no longer controls the property. He is conducting the prayer. Bramwell controls the guest list." Gideon looked at the printed cards placed on the pews. Several local officials had brought assistants who were not listed. Contractors wandered freely near the rear doors. "You invited the man who designed the parking lot. He is part of the project. I repaired the bell you intend to ring at the end. You are staff." The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Conrad gestured toward the side corridor. "Wait there until we need you." Gideon did not move. Preston Valehurst approached from the altar. Unlike his son, Preston was in his late 60s and carried the formal politeness of a man who preferred humiliation to occur quietly. "Is something wrong?" "Mr. Price believes he should sit with the guests," Conrad said. "I did not ask for a special seat," Gideon replied. "I intended to stand in the rear as I have at every service for 28 years." Preston glanced around the chapel. "Today is complicated. The chairs are simple." Conrad exhaled impatiently. "This is exactly why staff boundaries matter." The Orison family representative, Eleanor Orison March, turned from the first pew. She was 72, elegantly dressed in gray silk, and had spent decades serving as president of the Historical Society. "Who is he?" she asked. "The caretaker," Conrad said. Eleanor looked at Gideon as if trying to place him. "Price?" "Yes." "Your father was Amos Price." "He was." "He rang the bell at my wedding." "He did." Eleanor's expression softened briefly. Then Conrad said, "We are about to begin." She looked away. No one told Gideon to stay. No one asked Conrad to stop. The silence made the decision for them. Gideon walked toward the rear pew. Conrad blocked him. "I was clear. This chapel is still open to the town until your renovation permit is approved. Not during a private event." "Then why is the main door unlocked?" Conrad turned toward two security officers hired for the ceremony. "Escort him out." Several guests heard. The string music continued, but conversations lowered. Gideon looked at Preston. "You are allowing this?" Preston adjusted one cuff. "My son is managing today's event." Gideon looked toward Eleanor. She avoided his eyes. The officers approached. Gideon removed the ring of keys from his belt and placed it on the nearest pew. "I will not make you drag me from a chapel my family kept alive." Conrad picked up the keys. "Your employment is suspended until further notice." "For attending a prayer?" "For refusing instructions." Gideon walked down the center aisle. He passed the stone pillars his great-grandfather had supposedly raised. Past the carved rail his grandfather repaired after a fire. Past the plaque giving every visible piece of history to Horace Orison. When Gideon reached the doors, Reverend Thomas Clay stopped speaking. The elderly minister stood beside the altar holding an open Bible. "Gideon," Conrad answered for him, "there is an employment matter. Please continue." Reverend Clay looked at the security officers, then at Gideon. "What happened?" "I was told the chapel has no seat for its caretaker." A murmur moved through the pews. Conrad stepped forward. "This is inappropriate." "Yes," Gideon said. "It is." The officers opened the doors. He walked into the rain. Conrad locked them behind him. The ceremony resumed. Gideon stood beneath the porch for several minutes, listening to strangers discuss preservation inside the building he was no longer permitted to enter. Then the first thunder rolled over the valley. The storm had arrived earlier than forecast. Wind moved through the cedar trees, bending their dark branches toward the cemetery. Rainwater rushed along the stone gutters. Gideon looked up at the bell tower. The western shutter had come loose. It struck the frame repeatedly. If the wind strengthened, the shutter could tear free and damage the bell supports. Gideon reached automatically for his keys. They were inside. He walked around the chapel and entered the old tool shed through a rear door that no longer locked properly. A second set of tower keys hung behind a wooden panel. His father had placed them there years earlier. Gideon climbed the exterior maintenance stairs toward the tower. Inside the chapel, Preston Valhurst had begun his speech. St. Orison represents the enduring vision of families who understood that prosperity carries responsibility. Conrad stood beside a large presentation board displaying architectural renderings. The restored chapel appeared beneath soft lights, surrounded by landscaped gardens and valet parking. The caretaker's cottage was absent. Preston continued, "My family is honored to protect what Horace Orison gave this community more than a century ago." Eleanor smiled politely from the front pew. A violent gust shook the stained glass windows. Dust fell from the rafters. Guests glanced upward. Conrad signaled to an assistant to continue the presentation. In the tower, Gideon secured the loose shutter with a temporary iron brace. As he tightened the final bolt, he heard an unfamiliar metallic scrape behind the bell. The Orison bell had moved slightly inside its wooden frame, not enough to swing, enough to reveal a narrow bronze plate pressed against the rear support. Gideon had never seen it. The plate appeared to be part of the bell's mounting collar. Layers of soot and oil covered its surface. Lightning flashed through the tower window. For one moment, Gideon saw letters beneath the dirt. He took a cloth from his pocket and wiped the metal. The first word appeared. Cast. Then a name. E. Price. Gideon stopped breathing. He cleaned farther. A full inscription emerged around the hidden collar. Cast by Elijah Price and Sons for the Free Chapel of Lower Bellwether, 1910. Beneath it were smaller letters. Raised by the hands of those who built without credit, may this bell speak when we cannot. Gideon touched the name. Elijah Price was his great-great-grandfather. Family stories said Elijah had worked as an iron founder before the local foundry burned. No one had known he cast the chapel bell. The inscription had been positioned against the support where it could not be seen from the floor. Either the bell had turned over time or someone had deliberately hidden the words during installation. Another gust moved the bell slightly. A small iron compartment behind the mounting plate opened. Inside rested a cylindrical copper case sealed with wax. Gideon removed it carefully. The wax carried a symbol he recognized from his grandfather's old toolbox, a hammer crossing a bell rope. He carried the case down one level to the tower landing. The seal broke beneath his thumb. Inside were rolled papers wrapped in oilcloth. The first was a construction ledger. The second was a signed agreement. The third was a list of names. Gideon unfolded the agreement with trembling hands. It was dated February 12, 1910. Horace Orison had signed it. So had Reverend Nathaniel Voss, Elijah Price, Ezekiel Price, carpenter Matthew Grady, stonemason Silas Freeman, and 12 other workers. The agreement stated that Horace Orison would provide stone from his quarry and a portion of construction funding. The workers of Lower Bellwether would contribute labor, materials, and money collected from their community. When completed, the chapel would belong to a public trust administered jointly by the congregation and the Workers' Association. No Orison descendant would possess the right to sell it. The document also stated that the bell had been donated by Elijah Price and his sons. Horace was not the chapel's sole founder. He was not even its largest financial contributor. The ledger recorded every payment: church suppers, worker wages donated back into construction, lumber purchased by black carpenters, stone cut after normal quarry hours, bronze contributed from tools, fixtures, and scrap metal collected by families across Lower Bellwether. The final page showed the true ownership structure. The Lower Bellwether Chapel Trust held 70%. Horace Orison held a temporary 30% interest until construction debts were repaid. Those debts had been fully repaid in 1914. Horace's interest should then have ended. Instead, 2 years later, he recorded the property solely under the Orison family name. Gideon stared at the documents while thunder moved around the tower. Below him, applause began inside the chapel. Preston had reached the conclusion of his speech. "And now," he said, "my son Conrad will ring the Orison bell to mark a new beginning." Conrad signaled to an assistant near the rear. The assistant looked toward the empty caretaker's position. "Where is the bell rope?" Conrad frowned. "It should be beside the tower stairs." Reverend Clay said quietly, "Only Gideon rings it during storms." "This is not a storm signal." Thunder struck so close that the windows shook. The lights flickered, then went out. Guests gasped. Emergency lamps activated along the walls. A security officer opened the rear corridor but found the tower door locked. Conrad held up Gideon's keys. "I have them." He tried 3 keys before finding the correct one. As he opened the tower door, the old bell rang once. The sound struck the chapel like a physical force, low, deep, powerful enough to silence every voice. Conrad stepped back. The bell rang a second time, then a third. Reverend Clay looked toward the windows. "That is the flood warning." Preston turned to him. "The river is miles away. The lower creek rises first." Gideon appeared at the top of the tower stairs holding the copper case beneath one arm. "Clear the lower road," he said. Conrad stared at him. "What are you doing here?" The western shutter was failing. "You entered after being removed from the property." "I prevented damage to your bell." "It is not his bell," Reverend Clay said. Everyone looked at him. The minister's eyes were fixed on the papers in Gideon's hand. "What did you find?" Gideon descended the stairs. "The answer to that question." Conrad stepped toward him. "Give me those documents." "No." "They were found on property owned by Bramwell Heritage." "They were found inside a bell cast by my family for a public chapel." Eleanor rose from the front pew. "What are you talking about?" Gideon walked toward the altar and placed the construction ledger on the table. The chapel lights returned. Under the bright ceiling fixtures, the age signatures became visible. Reverend Clay read the first page. His hands began shaking. "Where was this?" "Hidden behind the bell's mounting collar." Eleanor approached. Gideon showed her the agreement. She recognized Horace Orison's signature immediately. The Historical Society owned hundreds of his letters. "This could be a reproduction," Conrad said. "It has been sealed for over a century," Reverend Clay replied. "You cannot know that." Gideon placed the broken wax seal beside the papers. Eleanor touched the edge of the ledger. Her face had become pale. "These names," she whispered. She read them aloud. Elijah Price, Ezekiel Price, Matthew Grady, Silas Freeman. Local streets carried several of those names, though most residents no longer knew why. Gideon opened the list of workers. 53 people were identified. Beside each name appeared a trade, contribution, or number of unpaid construction hours. At the bottom, written in different ink, was a statement signed by Reverend Voss. "This chapel stands because the people of Lower Bellwether gave what they could not afford to lose. No donor shall erase the builders by purchasing the story afterward." No one applauded. No one moved. Conrad reached for the document. Gideon pulled it back. "It belongs with an independent archivist. It belongs to the property owner. The agreement says the property owner is the public trust. That trust no longer exists." Reverend Clay looked at him. "The congregation still exists." "Not as a legal body." Eleanor continued reading. "The Orison family had no right to sell." Preston stepped beside her. "We purchased through a title company. The deed was verified." "The deed may have been created from a fraudulent transfer," she said. Conrad's jaw tightened. You are not an attorney. No, I am the president of the historical society your company used to promote this restoration. Preston lowered his voice. Eleanor, we should review this privately. She looked at him. Why? To avoid confusion. For whom? Gideon heard vehicles approaching outside. The storm warning had drawn local emergency crews toward the hill. Rainwater was already flooding the lower road. He turned to Reverend Clay. Open the chapel basement. Families from the creek houses may need shelter. Conrad stepped between them. This is a private event. Gideon looked around at the wealthy guests occupying the pews. Then your private event can help move tables. The first evacuated family arrived 15 minutes later, then another. The luxury dedication ceremony became an emergency shelter. Guests carried chairs aside. Caterers served food intended for donors to wet children and elderly residents. The chapel's generator powered medical equipment for a woman who had left home without her oxygen unit. Gideon continued ringing the warning pattern until emergency officials confirmed that the lower road was closed. The bell cast by Elijah Price guided the town again. By evening, photographs of the documents had reached the local newspaper. The headline appeared the next morning. Hidden Bell Records. Challenge ownership of historic chapel. Bramwell Heritage Group issued a statement questioning the authenticity of the discovery. Conrad described Gideon as a recently suspended employee who had entered a restricted tower without permission. He did not mention that Gideon entered to secure the building during a storm. He also did not mention throwing him out of the chapel. Guests had recorded that part. A video showed Conrad ordering security to remove Gideon while refusing him a place at the ceremony. Another recorded the moment Gideon returned with the copper case. The contrast spread quickly online. In one clip, Conrad said, "Your family history does not create property rights." Minutes later, the hidden agreement appeared to prove exactly the opposite. Gideon did not speak to reporters immediately. He gave the documents to Dr. Miriam Voss, an independent archivist and descendant of Reverend Nathaniel Voss. She assembled specialists in paper conservation, metallurgy, handwriting analysis, and property law. The results supported authenticity. The paper, ink, and wax dated to the early 20th century. Horace Orison's signature matched verified documents. The bronze mounting plate had been cast with the bell rather than added later. Microscopic examination showed the inscription had been deliberately positioned against the wooden support during installation. Someone intended to conceal it. Researchers searched county archives. They found references to the Lower Bellwether Chapel Trust in tax records from 1911 through 1915. Then it disappeared. A deed recorded in 1916 transferred the chapel from Horace Orison personally to the Orison Family Foundation. That deed claimed Horace had financed and owned the entire project. The signature attributed to Reverend Voss was forged. The authentic agreement inside the bell proved he had never held full ownership. Further evidence emerged from newspapers serving the black community at the time. One article described fundraising for the People's Chapel on Orison Hill. Another listed contributions from quarry workers and domestic servants. A photograph showed Elijah Price standing beside the newly cast bell. The caption read, "Master founder Elijah Price presents the community bell before its raising." The mainstream Bellwether newspaper from the same week showed Horace Orison standing beside the bell. Its caption called him the donor. Elijah had been cropped from the photograph. Gideon studied the two images side by side. In one, his ancestor stood with both hands resting proudly against the bronze. In the other, only part of his sleeve remained near the edge. The legal case moved quickly because Conrad had already begun seeking renovation permits. Reverend Clay, Gideon, descendants of the named workers, and several community organizations filed suit to restore the chapel trust and invalidate the sale. Bramwell's attorneys argued that even if the original trust existed, a century of recorded ownership gave the Orison family clear title. Attorney Lena Harcourt represented the community. She argued that ownership obtained through forged documents and concealed trust records could not become honest merely because the fraud survived for generations. The defendants asked the court to reward the duration of the silence, she said, but the silence was engineered by hiding the evidence inside the very bell donated by the people whose rights were erased. Eleanor Orison March shocked her family by joining the case on Gideon's side. Her nephews accused her of betraying the Orison legacy. She answered publicly, "A legacy that depends upon removing the builders' names deserves correction, not protection." The Orison family archives contained letters that strengthened the case. One letter from Horace to his attorney discussed consolidating the chapel title before Voss and the colored craftsmen begin imagining permanent claims. Another instructed workers to place the founder inscription toward the rear of the bell frame. The most damaging letter was written after Elijah Price demanded the final wages owed to the construction crews. Horace wrote, "They have their chapel and may worship inside it. That should be sufficient reward for men who could never have raised such a building without my quarry." The ledger showed the opposite. The workers had paid for the stone through donated labor. Horace had charged the trust for materials he later claimed to have given freely. Gideon read the letter in Lena's office. "My great-great-grandfather built the bell, paid toward the chapel, and still had to ask for his wages." Lena nodded, and Horace converted the request into evidence of ingratitude. That part has not changed much. Conrad's defense focused on Gideon. He claimed the caretaker had motive to fabricate or manipulate evidence because the redevelopment threatened his cottage and employment. Experts confirmed the copper case could not have been placed behind the century-old mounting system without dismantling the bell. Maintenance records showed the bell had not been removed since 1911. Conrad then argued that Gideon failed to report the documents immediately and might have altered them. Multiple guests had seen him descend from the tower minutes after discovering the case. Reverend Clay recorded the first opening of the ledger on his phone. Nothing supported alteration. During his deposition, Conrad was asked why Gideon had been removed from the ceremony. He refused staff instructions. What instruction? To remain in the service area. Why was the caretaker excluded from a heritage preservation event? It was a donor ceremony. Were architects present? Yes. Contractors? Yes. Local officials? Yes. Members of the Orison family? Yes. Was anyone else removed for lacking a formal invitation? No. Why Gideon? Conrad paused. He became confrontational. The video showed Gideon speaking calmly. Conrad's tone was louder. The attorney played the recording. Afterward, she asked, which statement was confrontational? Conrad said, his attitude was clear. That answer followed him through the rest of the case. The court issued a temporary order stopping all renovations, demolition, and access restrictions. The caretaker's cottage remained standing. Gideon was reinstated as temporary site custodian under court supervision. On his first morning back, he unlocked the chapel doors at 7. No donors waited. No cameras, only Mrs. Halpern, an 80-year-old widow who came every Monday to place flowers beside her husband's grave. She touched Gideon's arm. Your people built it. So did many others. But they hid your name. They hid many names. Gideon opened the ledger to show her. Her grandfather's surname appeared among the laborers. He had hauled timber from the river. Mrs. Halpern cried when she saw it. Over the following months, descendants came from across the state. Some carried photographs. Others brought family Bibles, tools, letters, or stories, dismissed for generations as exaggerations. A woman named Clara Freeman brought a carved wooden mallet bearing the same crossed hammer and rope symbol found on the wax seal. Her grandfather Silas had used it while shaping the chapel beams. A retired teacher produced minutes from the Lower Bellwether Women's Mutual Society, showing that women who worked as cooks and laundresses raised nearly 1/4 of the construction fund. Their names did not appear on any plaque. The history of the chapel expanded beyond the Price family. That mattered to Gideon. He did not want one erased family replaced by another single heroic name. The evidence showed the chapel was built collectively. Elijah cast the bell. Ezekiel supervised stonework. Silas shaped beams. Women raised funds. Children collected scrap bronze. Quarry workers cut stone at night. Horace supplied land and equipment, but not the entire vision, money, or labor. Truth did not require removing him. It required reducing him to his actual size. The ownership trial lasted 9 weeks. Preston Valhurst testified that Bramwell purchased the property in good faith. Lena asked whether the company had reviewed the chapel's full historical record before marketing it as an Orison family monument. We relied on the recorded deed and historical society materials. Did you consult the caretaker? No. Why not? We did not consider him an ownership source. Did you ask whether his family had any connection to the building? No. Yet you planned to demolish the cottage where chapel caretakers had lived for nearly a century. It had no protected designation. Who prepared the historical assessment? A consultant. Paid by Bramwell? Yes. Did that consultant interview residents of Lower Bellwether? I do not know. The consultant had not. The report relied almost entirely on Orison family records, the same family whose forged deed created the recorded ownership. Eleanor testified next. Conrad's attorney accused her of supporting the lawsuit because of a private disagreement with the Valahursts. She remained calm. I supported the restoration until I saw the agreement. Your family maintained the chapel for generations. Gideon's family maintained it. Mine placed its name on the wall. Horace Orison donated the land. Yes. So he was a founder. One of them. Yet you now wish to destroy his reputation. No, I wish to stop using reputation as a substitute for evidence. Gideon testified on the final week. Conrad's attorney displayed photographs of the cottage. You would have lost your home if Bramwell's plan proceeded. Yes. You would have lost your employment. Possibly. So you benefited personally from the discovery. I benefited from the truth being found. You expect the court to believe you entered the tower only because of a loose shutter? Maintenance logs show I reported the shutter twice before the ceremony. Yet you chose the exact moment of Bramwell's dedication to enter. The storm chose the moment. Some people in the courtroom smiled. The attorney did not. You rang the bell and interrupted the event. I rang the flood warning. Without authorization. The creek had crossed the lower road. You could have used a telephone. Several homes were without power and the bell reaches the valley. Are you suggesting an antique bell remains part of modern emergency infrastructure? I am saying people heard it and left before the water rose. Emergency records confirm that 11 families evacuated after hearing the warning. The attorney changed direction. Your grandfather told you the Price family built the chapel. He said the community built it. But you repeated those stories for years without proof. I repeated them as family history. Then suddenly proof appeared exactly when you needed it. Gideon looked toward the gallery where descendants of the builders sat together. The proof appeared because the bell shifted during a storm. Convenient. For me? Yes. Gideon's expression remained steady. My family maintained that bell for 4 generations without knowing the evidence was inside it. Convenient would have been finding it before my grandfather died, believing no one would ever see Elijah's name. The courtroom became silent. The judge ruled 2 months later. The 1916 deed was declared fraudulent. The sale to Bramwell Heritage Group was voided. The Lower Bellwether Chapel Trust was legally restored under modern nonprofit law. Ownership would be held by a board representing the congregation, descendants of documented builders, local residents, preservation experts, and the town. No family or company could sell the chapel independently. The cemetery remained permanently public. The caretaker's cottage received protected historical status. Bramwell recovered part of its purchase payment from the Orison family estate but received no development rights. Conrad resigned from the project. Preston issued a carefully written apology saying the company had relied on incomplete records. Gideon answered through Lena, "The records were incomplete because people with power decided whose records counted." The old plaque was removed from the chapel entrance. Not destroyed. It was placed inside a historical exhibition explaining how the false founder story had been created. A new bronze panel was installed beside it. It listed all 53 names found inside the bell, along with the Women's Society, the congregation, and other contributors later confirmed through research. Horace Orison's name appeared among them, not above them. The chapel reopened 1 year after the storm. The ceremony was public. No private donor section occupied the front pews. Mrs. Halpern sat beside Clara Freeman. Former Quarry families filled the center aisle. Eleanor attended without reserving a special seat. Preston came alone and remained near the back. Conrad did not appear. Reverend Clay invited Gideon to speak. He stood beneath the restored bell rope wearing the same dark caretaker's coat he had worn when he was removed. "My family did not build this chapel alone," he began. "That is not what the bell revealed." He looked toward the wall of names. It revealed something more difficult for people accustomed to simple monuments. It revealed that a building remembered as one rich man's gift was made by many people whose money, skill, labor, and faith were treated as though they became his property the moment the work was finished. He paused. "My great-great-grandfather cast the bell. My great-grandfather helped raise the tower. My grandfather and father cared for this place. But this chapel belongs neither to the Price family nor the Orison family. It belongs to the public trust its builders created." Gideon turned toward the tower stairs. The inscription inside the bell says, "May this bell speak when we cannot." For more than a century, those words faced a wooden wall. He pulled the rope. The bell rang once. The sound moved through the chapel, across the cemetery, down the hill, and into Lower Bellwether. A century earlier, Elijah Price had cast that sound from donated bronze. Horace Orison had placed his own name above the doors, but he had never managed to own the bell's voice. After the ceremony, the trust board offered Gideon the position of executive director. He declined. "I am a caretaker." The board chair smiled. "You could be both." "No, someone else should manage meetings and budgets. I want authority over preservation, public access, and the bell." The new title became Keeper of the Chapel and Community Historian. Gideon hired apprentices from Bellwether High School to learn stone repair, woodworking, metal conservation, and archival research. He required every student to study the ledger before touching the building. "Restoration is not only repairing what time damaged," he told them. "Sometimes it means repairing what the official story damaged." The caretaker's cottage became a research center rather than a private residence. Gideon moved into a smaller house nearby and allowed visiting descendants to use the rooms while examining family records. The lower field remained grass. No valet parking was built. Weddings still took place at the chapel, but couples could not close the cemetery or remove local visitors. Fees supported building maintenance and community programs. The most requested wedding tradition became the ringing of the old bell. Gideon permitted it only after telling each couple who cast it. Years later, a child visiting the tower asked why the inscription had been hidden. Gideon showed her the place where the bronze collar once faced the support. Someone thought turning the words toward the wall would make them disappear. Did it? For a while. Why did the bell move? A storm. The child looked at the enormous bronze shape above them. Did it want people to know? Gideon smiled. Bells do not want things. But it told. Yes, he said. Eventually, it told. They threw the black caretaker out of the chapel because they saw him as an employee standing in the way of a wealthy family's celebration. They believed the Orison name carved above the entrance gave them the right to decide who belonged inside. Then the storm shifted the ancient bell. Behind its mounting collar, Gideon found his ancestor's name, the original trust agreement, the construction ledger, and the list of workers whose hands had raised the chapel. The old bell revealed that Elijah Price had cast it, that Ezekiel Price helped build the tower, that families from Lower Bellwether donated money, timber, stone, bronze, and years of labor, and that Horace Orison had used a forged deed to claim a public chapel as his private gift. The new owners threw Gideon out because they believed caretakers merely protected other people's property. The bell revealed that his family had been protecting their own history all along,